I have been the Duke of Belhaven for 11 years, but I was a poor astronomer for the first 5 of those years, and it was Miss Prudence Weld who taught me, without ever saying that she was teaching me, the true difference between a copied table and one that has been calculated. It happened at a country subscription library on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and I set it down now, in my own hand and in my own voice, because I owe her that much. Belhaven is a small dukedom by the standards of the great houses, 12,000 acres, a good tenantry, a plain classical hall built by my grandfather, but the family has kept for 4 generations a private observatory in the east wing. My grandfather set it up, my father used it. I inherited both the instruments and the habit, and had, in the years since I came into the title, been trying to compile, for the county's use, a working almanac, the sunrise and sunset tables, the moon phases, the movable feasts, the equinoxes and solstices, and the local tide times at the 2 small ports the estate holds shares in. I had been at this 5 winters. The tables I produced worked, but I knew they were not quite right. My moon table drifted by half a minute a year against the observed. My tide times at Belhaven in the Sands were half an hour out at every spring tide. I could not find the error. In the November of the 5th winter I went, on the advice of my agent, to the small subscription library at Belhaven town, a good country library of some 3,000 volumes over a draper's shop, kept by Mr. Weld, a man of 53 who had been the town's schoolmaster before his sight had begun to fail him. He kept the library now with his daughter. He had taken over from the previous librarian 10 years before at half his old salary, because the town had lost patience with the man before him and had put an advertisement in the county paper, and Mr. Weld had answered it in a good hand. I went for a copy of the nautical almanac from the year before, because I could not find my own. I came away with something else. Mr. Weld was in the front room speaking with 2 farmers about a book on drainage. Miss Weld, 26, small, plain, wearing a dark grey stuff dress and a plain white collar and no ornament, was at the librarian's high desk copying a subscriber's list into a fresh ledger. She rose when I came in and made me my bow and sat down again. She did not stare and she did not simper. I asked her for the almanac. She said 1809 or 1810, Your Grace. I said 1810. She rose again, went to a cupboard behind her, returned with the volume, opened it to check that no page was loose, and set it on the desk. She said, There is a book of local tide observations at the back of the row that Papa keeps beside it. Would Your Grace care to see it? I said I should. She brought it. It was a plain quarto in a marbled paper cover, 180 pages of manuscript in a good clear hand, and it contained 10 years of daily tide observations at Belhaven in the Sands, taken by the tide master's father before him and continued by the tide master. I had not known it existed. I said, How came the library to have this? She said, My father copied it for a marine surveyor in 1804 and kept his copy. The tide master's original is at the harbor office. She said, It is very good. I sat at the reading table under the window and worked at the book for 2 hours. It was better than very good. It was exact. The tide times had been taken at the beach itself, not at a station, and the 10 years of observation showed a pattern I had not seen in any published table. The tide at Belhaven in the Sands ran 29 minutes late at the spring tide and 12 minutes early at the neap, on account of the shape of the estuary. My almanac had been out by exactly those amounts. I had been correcting an accurate model with an inaccurate correction. The trouble was not in my calculation. The trouble was that I had been using a table that did not know the shape of Belhaven's own beach. When I looked up from the book, the winter afternoon was almost gone. Miss Weld had brought me a small pot of tea I had not asked for and a plate with 2 ginger biscuits on it. She was back at her ledger copying, and she had not spoken to me since she had brought the book. I said, Miss Weld, whose hand is this? She said, without looking up, My father's, Your Grace. I said, Whose calculation is it? She looked up. Her face went very still. She said, It is my father's book. I said, Miss Weld, the observations in the book are your father's. The correction table on pages 142 through 156 is not. I said, Whoever calculated that table used the observations to derive a local tidal constant, and then applied it correctly. That is calculation, not observation. I have been at this myself for 5 winters, and I have not derived the constant. Whose work is it? She said, It does not matter, Your Grace. I said, It does. Whose? She said, Mine. I said, You calculated the local tidal constant for Belhaven in the Sands. She said, Yes. I said, How old were you? She said, 21 when I did that table, 23 when I checked it against 3 more years of my father's observation. I have not published it. It stands under his hand and my father's name because a subscription library kept by a country schoolmaster will lose subscribers if it is known his daughter did the working. I have taught myself the mathematics from books in my father's cupboard. I do not wish to be talked of, she said. I would be obliged if your grace would not mention it. I said, Miss Weld, I have been compiling an almanac for the estate for 5 winters. My moon tables drift by half a minute a year. Have you ever calculated a local moon correction? She said. For the estate as a whole, no. For Belhaven in the Sands, yes, it corrects to the ephemeris by 11 seconds. I said, you have done the moon. She said, yes. I said, do you know why my table drifts? She said, you are using the equation of time from the London ephemeris. Belhaven lies 2 degrees 7 minutes west of Greenwich. Your table drifts by 9 minutes of longitude a year, and by a further 17 seconds of the equation of time correction, which together give you very nearly the half-minute you have named. I said, Miss Weld, would you consent to look at my almanac? She said, in what capacity, your grace? I said, in the capacity of the astronomer you are and I am not. She said, I cannot come to Belhaven Hall. I said, I shall bring the tables here. I brought them the next Wednesday. I brought them to the library at the reading table under the window, and I sat opposite her, and she read them through with a small ivory ruler under each line and a pencil in her hand. And she found 7 errors in the moon table, 4 in the equation of time, and 1 in the compilation of the movable feasts that I had inherited unquestioned from my father's edition. She would not accept a fee. She said the loan of the almanac to be checked was more than she had had in her life to work on, and that the error finding was its own return. Her father sat in the other room with the 2 farmers and heard none of it. I asked her whether he knew what she did. She said, he knows I keep his tide book. He does not know I have taught myself to calculate the moon. It would not comfort him. He has been ashamed enough of what his sight has cost me without knowing I have outworked him at the desk. I said, Miss Weld, that is a very great pity. I began to come every Wednesday. I brought a new sheet each time, sunrise tables, the local variation of the compass, a chart of the estate's fields with their new drainage runs, and she would put down the ledger and read through what I had brought, and she would find or not find errors in it. She never asked me to pay her. I began after the 5th Wednesday to leave a book with her, not lend, but leave from the shelves at Belhaven that she had had no access to. I left her a Laland. I left her a Bode. I left her on the 8th Wednesday my grandfather's own manuscript of an astronomical treatise he had never published, on the theory that a woman of 26 who could catch a moon correction of 17 seconds might read it and find its errors. She read it in a fortnight. She returned it with 3 sheets of small clear notes pinned inside the cover. The notes were the best commentary on my grandfather's work that had ever been made. I asked her on the 12th Wednesday whether she would allow me to name her in the printed almanac as its calculator. She said no. She said her father was living and that it would take from him a dignity he had earned by his other work and had a right to keep. She said she was content to have her working known to me and to her father's God. I said, Miss Weld, my grandfather's manuscript will be published by the Royal Society within 12 months. It has no true author now that he is gone. If I send it in and name you as the mathematician who corrected it, under an initial, if you wish, will you consent? She was silent a long time. She said, under an initial, and only if my father is asked and agrees. Her father was asked. He asked me in his failing sight whether I could tell him truly what his daughter's ability was. I said, sir, she is the finest calculator in the North Country, and I have known Sir David Brewster. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I have been in the way of a great work by keeping her at a librarian's desk. I said, you have kept her fed and warm and quiet enough to teach herself. I do not think you have been in the way of anything. He said, you are kind, Duke. Send it in under her initial. And you may tell the society that her name is Prudence Weld, and that she is my daughter. The manuscript went in. It was read at the society in the January, and its calculator was named, the first paper of a country astronomer's daughter that the society had accepted, and so far as I could learn, the first paper accepted under a woman's name in the society's calculational papers at all. The Belhaven Almanac, printed the same spring, carried in its errata sheet the notice that the compilation of tables had been corrected by P. Weld of Belhaven Town. The county subscribed to 500 copies. The Wednesday after the Royal Society read her paper, the county paper printed a short notice, and by the following Sunday the 2 dowagers who had spent the winter telling one another that I meant to marry a Miss Everard from York came up to Belhaven in the same carriage and had themselves announced together. They asked me over tea whether it was true that the almanac had been corrected by a woman in Belhaven Town. I said it was. They asked me whether the woman was well connected. I said her father was the librarian and her mother had been a farmer's daughter. They exchanged a look I had known since I was a boy. Lady Cardew asked whether I meant to marry her. I said, that is a decision for the lady and I have not asked her. Lady Frobisher asked whether it was really quite the thing. I said, "It is exactly the thing." They stayed a further 10 minutes and were driven out very civilly. They did not, so far as I heard, tell anyone that I had answered them plainly. They told everyone that the Duke of Belhaven had received them alone, without his intended, and that his intended did not yet know she was to have him. She did not know, I had not asked. I had come to think that spring that I did not wish to ask her in a room she had not chosen. I invited Mr. Weld and his daughter to the observatory one evening in April so that she might see her calculations tested against the sky. She came with her father in the small chaise I had sent for them, and I met them at the east wing door and led them up the winding stair, and I had the great achromatic set on Jupiter for her, and she looked through it in silence for 4 minutes and then straightened and said, "The bands are exactly where you said. My reduction was right." I said, "Miss Weld, your reduction has never been anything but right." She said nothing. Her father, in his blindness, stood at my elbow and said quietly, "Duke, I have not seen the sky in 9 years. Tell me she is looking at it." I said, "She is looking at Jupiter." He said, "Then I am content." He put his hand on the observatory table and I heard him say under his breath, "God be thanked." I did not ask her to marry me until the following August, and I did not do it at the library. I called at their cottage at her father's invitation on a Saturday evening after Michaelmas, and I asked Mr. Weld first, and I asked her afterwards in the small parlor with the ivy at the window without any speech about my rank or her lack of it. I said, "Miss Weld, I have wanted to ask you this for 8 months. I have not asked because I did not want you to think I was rewarding the working with a proposal. I ask you now because your father is well enough to lay it before you fairly. Will you marry me?" She said, "Are you asking me because you want a wife who can calculate?" I said, "I am asking because I want the woman who noticed the half-minute drift in a table that had been in my family's hand for 4 generations. She said, "That is a fair reason." She said, "Yes." We were married at the parish church at Belhaven in the following October, on a still bright morning after early frost. She wore a plain slate blue silk her mother had left her, and a small string of freshwater pearls I had given her the week before. Her father read the service in a good clear voice and gave her away in a hand no longer quite steady. The town was in the church. The tide master stood at the back with his hat in his hand and wept. She lives at Belhaven with me now. Her father lives at the parsonage cottage on our land, with a good fire and a good chair, and a young man from the parish who reads to him 3 evenings a week from the astronomical journals of Europe. The observatory in the east wing is hers by right of use. I go up to it now for company more than for calculation, and she has been the calculator of every Belhaven almanac since the year of our marriage. The tide master's book is on her desk beside my grandfather's manuscript, and the two of them together contain almost every good page of Belhaven mathematics that has ever been written. I have been sometimes asked in London, by men who have read her papers, what a duke does when he marries a woman more accomplished than himself. I have said what I truly think, which is that a duke may keep his rank if he chooses, or he may lay it down at a country library reading table when a small woman in a plain grey dress hands him a tide book and says, "It is very good," and he answers in a voice that had learnt to hear her, "It is better than that. Whose hand is it?" and thereby names, without at first knowing it, the true author of the almanac and the true mistress of his house. Ambrose Belhaven, 6th Duke of Belhaven, set down in his own hand in the spring of 1839 that the printed record of the almanac should be accompanied by the private one, and that any who read this hereafter should know a mind is not smaller for having been kept quiet.